Bit about, for those of you who are not familiar with Bowen, what it is, a little bit about how it works, and how we teach it, and how it's applied in practice. I've been doing Bowen for nearly 30 years now, which is a bit shocking when I realized. And when I first learned Bowen, this was back in '94. We actually learned the whole thing, the whole course, in 4 days, which was kind of ridiculous, really. And when it was first taught, there wasn't much explanation about what we were really doing and why. And I think the reason for that is, and I'll explain, I'll show some images and PowerPoint shortly. But I think the reason for that was that in the way historically Bowen developed his work, and he passed away in 1982, was that he was obviously, I mean, incredibly skilled practitioner and very, very intuitive. Like a lot of healers, I guess, they intuit to do things, but perhaps he couldn't explain it really in a sort of more cerebral way to other people about what he was doing and why. So it was down to a few different people to kind of shadow him in his clinic. And there was about 5 or 6 people who shadowed him over a few years in his clinic to kind of try and work out what he was doing. And one of the people that was there was Ozzy Wrench and his wife Elaine, who I've studied with a lot, and they're still around. They're still with us, luckily, in Australia. Ozzy is must be about 90 now, I guess. And so the way it developed was that Ozzy would observe Tom working. He used to go there a few days a week over a period of years, and then kind of write it down in some kind of sense, and then check with Tom Bowen about what he was doing. And when Tom died in 1982, it wasn't, I think, until 1985 that Ozzy Wrench decided that he thought he would try and teach it. And initially he thought that actually this is impossible. It's too different to what people are used to, and it's so difficult to explain it. But however, he ran his first course in 1985 in Australia, and then from since then, it was brought over to all over the world. So it first was brought over to the UK, I think, in 1993, and I learnt it in '94, '95. So very early on. So, and then really since then, since I did those initial 4 days, when I realized the power of it, that was the thing. I didn't really know what I was doing, but it was obviously very powerful. So I started using. I mean, what happened was actually that I was worked on a guy who ran a clinic, and this man had suffered a skiing injury about 10 years ago and had really excruciating back pain ever since then. And he tried all kinds of stuff. And I gave him a Bowen treatment, not really knowing what I was doing, to be honest. But anyway, he got significantly better very, very quickly. And so he said, well, John, this is extraordinary. I'd like you to come to my clinic and give a talk about Bowen. And I said, stupidly, I said, oh, well, fine, you know. And so I turned up at his clinic, and there was a room packed with people. And I didn't really know what to say. So I thought it best just to give a demonstration and see. So we did some shoulder work and neck work and stuff. And, the results were pretty good. So then he said, well, you've got to come and work next week. You've got to start at my clinic. So I started very much at the deep end. And then I really spent a long time trying to work out how Tom Bowen's work was actually working and how we could refine it in terms of our understanding. So I started doing a lot of research into the nature of fascia. And at that time, the research into fascia was just beginning, really. I mean, it's really, really taken off, as you know, over the last 10, 15 years. But then it was just beginning. And there were people like Dean Juhan writing about it, who we've had on our platform, and others. And so as I began to study it, I began to realize how clever this technique was and how it really aligns with a lot of our current understanding about fascia. And of course, when you look back at this, the way of working, it has a long history. If you look back at the origins of osteopathy, for example, then the originator of osteopathy was absolutely fascinated with fascia, and Andrew Taylor Still, he talked a lot about how important it was that fascia in the body as a connective substance was free to move. He talked a lot about how stagnation in the body created disease. So the origins of osteopathy, which go back, 150 years or so, or more, was all about how do you restore function through creating more fluidity and movement and free movement and fluid exchange in the tissues, and particularly the fascia, which is kind of what we're doing with Bowen in a little bit of a different kind of way. So I'd like to just show you some images now, if that's all right, and we can then open up for a discussion towards the end. So I'll just share my screen, and I'll just show you some PowerPoint images here. If I can find it, it's the one. Cool. Great. So let's see. Play from the beginning. Cool. Yeah, so we sometimes call it Bowtech, is the Australian term for the Bowen technique, and that's me down there, John Wilks, and I run a platform called ehealthlearning.tv, and also another platform supporting people working with mothers and babies called ourbirthjourney.com, so you can have a look at those. And on eHealth Learning, we have a lot of related Bowen stuff. That's a lovely picture of Tom Bowen. As I said, he wasn't a particularly good communicator. He was quite taciturn, you could say, very much self-taught. So, his life started as a manual worker in the docks and the cement factory and things like that, and studied a lot with various what were then termed osteopaths and massage therapists, people like Ernie Saunders, who worked on the Australian Olympic teams and things like that. And he also was very interested in shiatsu, apparently, and Eastern approaches to medicine. But he was very self-taught, and I think he kind of considered himself an osteopath. But of course, osteopathy was not a regulated profession then in Australia. So he obviously picked up things from all over the place, and then at some point developed this system of working, which you could say is very, very minimal. And one of the features that you probably know about Bowen is that you do a little bit and then you wait and you come back and do some more. The reality is, in Tom Bowen's clinic, he was incredibly busy. He was seeing something like 60 people a day, massive amount, and still having an hour and a half for lunch, apparently. So, and still, having time off in the evening. So, the way he was working, he had 3 rooms in his clinic, and he would go from room to room. He had assistants helping to set the clients up and prepare them, but he would basically do work on one client and then move to the other room, do a bit more, and the 3rd room, and then go back. That was towards the end of his life. So, and you could say that the work developed from that, but actually there are very, very good physiological and anatomical reasons why these pauses, which we normally describe as around about 2 minutes, but sometimes they're longer, are so important. And these pauses between what we're doing in Bowen really allow the body to integrate what is offered to the body, which is fairly minimal, actually. So a Bowen practitioner might come in and obviously has done an assessment, decides, okay, we need to do this, and we'll do some Bowen type moves, which involve rolling type moves with a challenge over the skin, and then do a few of these moves and then leave the body. So what we're doing with that is sending an impulse through the tissues, through the fascia, through the nervous system, through the sensory nerves, through all these many, many different types of nerves in the fascia that have been identified. And all that information will, travel up through the spinal cord, through to various areas of the brain, like through your reticular formation, your cerebellum, and various other bits of the brain. And it's almost like with these Bowen moves, what you're doing is the person is lying on the couch. And because they're lying on the couch and there's really no interruption, we don't talk to them. We got them nice and warm and comfortable. We're not really interfering. Everything in their system can calm down, and they're not moving and they're not standing. So they're not getting all this information from their central nervous system. It's all very calm. And we come along and we do these specific Bowen moves, and the body thinks, oh, that's interesting. I need to pay attention to that. It's very unusual. And so it allows that process to work and recalibrate, if you like, within the brain. So these 2-minute breaks or 5-minute breaks, or however long they are really important in that process. So anyway, that's Tom Bowen. He also ran a free children's clinic on a Saturday. He was very passionate about helping out in the local community, which he did a lot. And he's been honoured in Geelong, where he worked, which is near Melbourne, about an hour from Melbourne in Australia. He's been honoured recently with a lovely sculpture in the local park there in Geelong. So a very much loved person there. And that's a picture of Oswald Wrench that I took. And that was probably about 20 or so years ago, because that's my son sitting on his lap. And, and my son at that time had never met Ozzy Wrench, as we call him, Ozzy. And was very hyperactive, actually. He was sort of rushing around the building because he was so excited to see everybody. Anyway, and I was watching Ozzy like a hawk, but he was doing these very simple moves on Lyndon and my son. And these 3 pictures were taken in about 2 or 3 minutes, actually. So you can see he's already a bit calmer there. That was him after 2 minutes, which is completely knocked out. And excuse me. So you can see in Bowen the way many of my clients and my colleagues' clients, when you start working, they very, very, very quickly go into a more parasympathetic or rest and repair state, and that's incredibly important. And that's partly how Bowen works in a way, is that it kind of switches off people's sympathetic nervous system and allows them to go into their kind of increases their vagal tone and goes into more of a parasympathetic state. And it does that in quite specific ways. The kind of moves that we use in Bowen have a direct stimulating effect on the vagus. And of course, the vagus is all the rage now, isn't it? Everybody's talking about the vagus and how important that is. And just that ability to kind of switch off, sink down, and go into that rest and repair place is absolutely crucial. I think particularly at this time when so many people are so stressed. And as we know, really healing can only really happen when people are, in that rest and repair state. So anyway, so that's Ozzy Wrench, who I learnt with a lot. He used to come over to England a couple of times a year with his wife, Elaine. So what structures do we move over in Bowen? We move over things like muscles, tendons, ligaments, nerves, joints, blood vessels even. And you could say that the common feature in all these things is that they are surrounded by fascia, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And fascia is integral to all these things. So, if you take a muscle, and sometimes we call muscles myofascia, you have the fascia around the muscle, which allows movement and free movement and fluidity between the structures, between other muscles, whatever the muscle is against. And then within the muscle, we have fascia around bunches of muscle fibers, and we have fascia around individual muscle fibers. So that all allows free movement, you could say. Same thing with tendons and ligaments, nerves surrounded by fascia, and as are blood vessels and capillaries. And they also sit within a network of fascia as well, under tension, actually. So fascia is integral to all those things. And in Bowen, we're working a lot with fascia. Like in this, so these are, you could say, structural bands of fascia. This is from one of my favorite books called The Endless Web, which was one of the early books on fascia, actually. It's a really wonderful book. And this image that you can see here is how these bands of fascia develop in response to loading and movement. So as the baby there begins to crawl and move and eventually stand up, then that sort of back line that we can see there through the IT band over to the buttocks and the thoracolumbar fascia around the sacrum and the lower back, and all the way through up the spine to the nuchal crests at the back of the occiput there. All that creates a very strong line, part of the lines that Tom Myers talks about. And so in Bowen, we tend to work those lines a lot. And there's been some very interesting research about the type of moves that we do in Bowen. So, for example, one of the moves that we might do is over the IT band. And most of those moves are cross fiber. Now, when you have these kind of bands of fascia like this, and these what we call aponeuroses, the fascial alignment of the collagen fibers, they tend to kind of line up. Yeah. Sometimes described a bit like soldiers lining up. And when you start applying pressure across fiber, you create these impulses through the fascia, which have been discovered and researched by people like Mei-Wan Ho and Jim Oshman and others, which create these kind of piezoelectric effects through the fascia, traveling through the fascia, have very strong healing properties. That's kind of one way that we work. But there's many other things that we do as well in Bowen. And we also, interestingly, tend to work these kind of layers. I know that a lot of people who study fascia say that there aren't really layers in the body. You can't really separate out the superficial fascia from the deep fascia, etc., which is true. There's a lot of that is done through dissection, which is sort of slightly artificial. But you do have these connecting layers, you could say. And in Bowen, we tend to work those slightly separately and slightly differently. So a lot of our Bowen work initially might be around that left side, around the erector spinae fascia and the muscles up the back. And then in the middle one, you can see the fascia of the latissimus dorsi, which attracts onto the humerus there, and thoracolumbar fascia. And then more superficial to that, we have the fascia of the trapezius. So there's a lot of Bowen moves that affect these, and they're quite simple. So we might work over the latissimus dorsi fascia by doing a sort of challenging type move, holding that challenge and kind of then rolling over it. And that creates a strong impulse. It also affects the hydration in the fascia. So we're applying pressure. It's a little bit like, pushing on a sponge or something like that. Imagine a sponge that's kind of full of water and you're pushing on it and it kind of gets the water out. And then when you release it, it rehydrates. And I know that Robert Schleip has done a lot of work on this to show that actually when you do those kind of moves that we do in Bowen, you create more hydration in the fascia. So that's a kind of fairly typical Bowen type move where we're placing our fingers or our thumb on the skin and we're taking a little bit of slack, skin slack, quite gently, in this case towards us, and then challenging medially towards the midline, towards the spine, holding that challenge on for a little bit. And usually we're trying to do this, time it with the person's exhalation. that as they exhale, we're going to move over the muscle. So that does many different things at once. And basically, really, I mentioned that Bowen was very intuitive, and he probably, he was working in the 1970s, 60s, 70s, so there wasn't any of this information out there really at the time about fascia. And it's really, he was absolutely on the nail in every single case about what he was actually doing in terms of affecting the fascia in a beneficial way. So we know from research into fascia that we can help with hydration of the myofascia. And I mentioned about osteopathy and how important that was in osteopathy. And it was important, and it is still important, in terms of a couple of things, really. One is fluid exchange. And so once you get good fluid exchange in the fascia, you get better waste away from the tissues, and you get better nutrients and things to the tissues, even down to a cellular level. So that's very important in terms of hydration and movement. And then you also have the thing about hydration affecting things like adhesion. So what you find is, because fascia is essentially, it's a very fluid network, isn't it? You've probably seen the images of Dr. Gimberto, but it's almost, it's sometimes described a bit like a very wet rainforest, with cables and, all kinds of stuff. It looks a bit like that. So, and that fluidity is very sugary. Gimberto describes it as glycosaminoglycans. It's very, so it could get quite sticky when it gets dry. And one of my colleagues described it a bit like, if you had, in your student days, if you had a cup of very, very sweet coffee and you happen to leave it on the windowsill for a few days, on a saucer, you'll find that it kind of sticks to the saucer because it becomes so sticky. So fascia is a bit like that when it becomes dehydrated, and that might be through things like underuse or, drinking enough water, but lack of movement. Then it becomes sticky. And when it becomes sticky, it doesn't move so freely. So part of what we do with Bowen is kind of separating out compartments of fascia, allowing more gliding type movements, allowing more hydration of the fascia through these kind of challenging type moves that we do. So that's one thing that we know it does. And then, because you could say that all our nerves and blood vessels, so capillaries particularly, as I said, they're surrounded by fascia, but they also sit in a network of fascia. And they sit in a network of fascia under tension, which is interesting. So once you start creating more fluidity in the tissue and in the fascia, you automatically create better nerve and blood supply. So, for example, nerves have their own blood supply to them, which is very important in terms of pain and efficiency. And so once you encourage that capillary action by freeing up and the surrounding fascia, which it's sitting in, then you're going to increase blood flow, which I've seen many times in my Bowen sessions. I'd never been able to explain it before, but you can kind of understand how that would work. And then I've mentioned a little bit about aiding relaxation by lowering the stress response. So, in other words, the word parasympathetic, which is part of the vagus, the para part of that parasympathetic is against or stopping or slowing down the sympathetic nervous system. And these days, so many people are kind of stuck, you could say, in a sympathetic activation. And when they're stuck in that, they're probably not sleeping very well. Probably their digestion is not very good, etc., etc. Very difficult for them to heal. So there's a couple of ways that Bowen does this quite specifically. One thing we do, we work a lot over areas in the body which have stretching surfaces. So we tend to work in Bowen a lot around joints, so that like around this area of the wrist, around the elbow, around the shoulder, around the neck, around the whole spine, around the knees, the feet, etc. A lot of these areas have particular receptors in the fascia called Ruffini receptors. And they respond to the kind of touch that we do, those kind of slow melting pressure type moves that we do. And when we stimulate those receptors, that has a very, very direct effect on stimulating the vagus. This research has gone back to the 1960s, actually, when looking at certain kinds of massage techniques which do a similar thing. And so that has a big effect on the hypothalamus. And when you do that, you also get a lowering of the general muscle tone in the body as well. So that's very well researched. And there's another way that we affect the parasympathetic and the vagus, which is through the light touch that we do in Bowen. There's some moves in Bowen which I never really understood what they were all about. For example, there's a move that we do over the coccyx, and that is incredibly gentle. And I thought that can't do anything at all. But when I began to research it, I realized, actually, that's working directly over the periosteum. And in the periosteum, you have huge numbers of these interstitial or free nerve endings. And we do it very lightly. And that kind of light touch on those areas, again, has this very, very, very strong stimulating effect on the vagus and the areas like the insular cortex, which is all to do with interoception and how our bodies feel and that kind of stuff. So again, it's, Bowen wouldn't have known any of this, but the fact is that's definitely how it's working. And then the other big thing that we use Bowen for, and is probably best known for musculoskeletal problems like lower back pain and frozen shoulder and tennis elbow, all those kind of things. But one thing that I've seen, and I see all the time in my practice, is massive changes in proprioception, and particularly in relation to posture and our relationship to gravity. And again, research has come out only not that long ago about how dense fascia that we find in the aponeurosis, and also in the tendons, particularly the myotendinous junctions. These receptors have a big effect on proprioception. They're all to do with proprioception, but also in relation to gravity. So we have specific ways of working with these proprioceptors, particularly around the joints. You find a lot of them around the joints that we work with Bowen, which have these massive effects on posture. And it's something we see all the time. And for me, it has been very, very difficult to explain why that is. So in terms of like pelvic alignment, someone comes in, I've had so many of these. Someone comes in, with an obvious postural irregularity, and you think, my gosh, what can I do about this? And you do a little bit of Bowen work, and when they get up, it's changed. And you think to yourself, well, that's not going to stay. And they come back next week and it's still the same. So, it's really quite remarkable. So yeah, big effects on proprioception. And also I would say about interoception. So interoception is very, very important in terms of people with chronic pain, things like fibromyalgia. And, with fibromyalgia, I have a lot of clients with fibromyalgia. And it's a horrible thing. And there's not much normal conventional medicine can really do with it. Unfortunately, a lot of my clients are often put on antidepressants. But Bowen is one of the things that can really, really, really help. We can use quite light touch with these people, and their sensitivity, their oversensitivity, hypervigilance really begins to settle down. They begin to sleep better. But anyway, again, there are direct pathways that we stimulate with Bowen that affect, as I mentioned, the insular cortex, which is all to do with interoception. And I remember a few years ago having a woman in with really, really quite severe fibromyalgia, actually. And I could hardly touch her. Her body was so sensitive. And again, I still think, oh my gosh, this is so difficult. What can I do here? But I did my best. I didn't do very much with her. And she was a very understated woman. She came back the next week and she said, and of course, one of the things that happens in fibromyalgia is often they don't sleep very well. It's one of the characteristics. And she said, "Oh, well, I've had some really good night's sleep since I saw you." And during that session, I could begin to use more normal pressure with her. And by session 4, she came in and she said, and this is someone who had to give up work and had to live in a bungalow because she couldn't manage the stairs. And she said by session 4, said, John, I've been thinking about going back to work. I feel so much better. I've got so much more energy. And my husband and I were thinking maybe we could move house and we could move into a normal 2 or 3 story house. And my jaw nearly hit the ground. It was absolutely beautiful. So these things happen. It's really extraordinary. So I'm going to skip some of this, but some of the other things that we work with Bowen are, you might have heard of the myofibroblasts. Myofibroblasts are, in fascia we have fibroblasts, which are the main cell in the fascia, and we have some of the cells within the fascia also called myofibroblasts because they have the characteristics of smooth muscle, and they provide, you could say, the sort of contractile properties in fascia. So in sites of injury or in frozen shoulder or lower back pain, you tend to get a build-up of these myofibroblasts, which creates stiffness and rigidity, which is not very helpful for people. And that's one way we work with them. We work with these myofibroblasts. They're very slow to respond. They're very affected by acidity in the body. And of course, acidity in the body can be linked with stress. People who are very stressed and not sleeping very well tends to create more of an acidic environment. Maybe their diet is not very good. And but anyway, when we put people into a more parasympathetic state, we will definitely affect the fascia in this way as well. And some of the different receptors that we work with, which I'm not going to go into now, which have been identified by Robert Schleip's talked a lot about these in relation to rolfing and massage and things like this and yoga, are the Golgi receptors, which we find in the myotendons and the dense fascia as well, and the Pacini's, which are all to do with proprioception, really, and the Ruffini's I've mentioned, and the interstitial or free nerve endings. So we affect all these receptors in kind of different ways. So that's why you'll find that some Bowen moves generally fairly slow, pretty gentle, but some are harder and some are longer challenge, and a few of them are quite fast. So it varies a lot depending on what we want to achieve and what we want to achieve. So, as I say, a lot of the work that we do is up the back. You have a lot of these Ruffini receptors around these erector spinae muscles, and in the fascia around the erector spinae group. And we also have a big effect on what are called the aponeuroses. So it's a funny word, aponeuroses, and I never really knew why it was called that. But aponeuroses are these big flat sheets of fascia. You're probably familiar with the one on the lower back, the thoracolumbar fascia, which is huge and has several layers to it. But there are other ones around the neck and between the shoulder blades, around the shoulders, and blah, 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 blah. But anyway, so these flat sheets, and the reason they're called aponeuroses is because when the first sort of anatomists came along and started cutting bodies up to look at them, they saw these flat sheets and they thought they were nerves. And that's why they call them aponeuroses. Of course, they're not nerves, they're fascia, but they're also very, very full of nerves. So it's like they were quite right in some respects. But their function is very interesting. And again, there's been quite a lot of research on this, that these aponeuroses work as like a bungee. So they store kinetic energy as you walk and as you have recoil from the earth. The thoracolumbar fascia acts as this kind of bungee, which helps in movement. So it's very important, actually, that you have hydration in the aponeuroses. They're able to do this, because otherwise people get very stiff and it takes much more effort to move and things like this. And I know there was some interesting research on this with kangaroos a while back, presumably done in Australia. But anyway, and they were intrigued because kangaroos apparently do not have enough energy in their muscles or power in their muscles to propel them in the huge kind of leaps that they do. So they looked at the aponeuroses, particularly in the gastrocnemius and the Achilles area and the poor kangaroo, and realized that actually there's this function of fascial recoil is really, really important, and the aponeuroses play that part in the ability of the kangaroo to jump, and the same way that we use it in running and walking as well. And of course, we use Bowen on animals. I work on dogs and cats, and even in the past worked on pigs, actually. I don't work on horses because I'm not qualified in equine Bowen, but that's very, very popular as well. So I'm just going to skip through some of these. And one of the other things that I love working with is babies. I really absolutely adore working with young ones and children, because really when we're working with them at that age, you hardly have to do anything really to achieve some really wonderful results. So I tend to work quite a lot with pregnant mums, which I know I've talked on one of the NAT courses, and working with babies, and there's a whole course on that as well that I've done for that as well. And I've written a couple of books. This little booklet here and a bigger book there, and I've written another one as well, about working more with complex and chronic conditions too. Okay, so I think what I'm going to do is stop sharing now. I think we've pretty much done that. I would just have a look at this. This is an interesting showing you the brainstem there, and just to explain kind of partly how Bowen works again in terms of what it's doing with stimulus. So when we do a classic Bowen move, the person is lying on the couch. There's not much happening in terms of other stimulation. We're stimulating some of these mechanoreceptors, and that stimulation is happening through the spinal cord, traveling up the spine to the reticular formation, which you can see right in the middle there. And part of the function of the reticular formation, you could say, is to filter out impulses or sensations that are familiar. Now, and there's a good reason for that, because as we walk around during the day, in our daily life, where there's hundreds of thousands of pieces of information coming in to our nervous system all the time, which the body has to know what to do with. And most of that is happening on an unconscious level. So the function of the reticular formation is to filter that out. But if something comes in that the body needs to pay attention to, that is perhaps unusual or unique, you could say, the reticular formation says, oh, this is interesting. This has never happened before. I must pay attention to this. And it will allow that information to go to various other parts of the brain and be shuttled backwards and forwards between this area and that area there to try and make sense of it. So places like thalamus, and cerebellum, and all this corrective feedback mechanism that happens. So that's part of what we're doing with Bowen. When someone's lying down, you're just putting these moves in. The body's never felt anything like this before. And it says, oh, let's pay attention to this. What's happening? And during that 2-minute break, that's when the body starts to recalibrate. And of course, what we're doing a lot with Bowen is working not just with tight areas of the body. Really, if you look at this picture here, which is from my little booklet there, you can see that you have a kind of cascade. This is a very common kind of posture. We call it a head forward posture, which is a kind of cascade of weakness and tightness. So what we might call locked long muscles and locked short. So for example, this poor person here, pretty tight in the pecs probably, which is incredibly common these days, isn't it? With all the texting, all the computer work we do. And that probably is going to bring their scapula forward, probably put excessive tension on the upper thoracic area there. So they tend to be weak in the thoracic area, but tight in the neck, tight in the lower back, but weak in the glutes, etc., and weak in the abdominals. So kind of cascade of tightness and weakness through the body. And of course, in this posture, where someone is having to use their muscles to this extent, they're going to be very, very tired because most of your energy goes into your muscle system. And so one of the things that happens as soon as you begin to change this with Bowen, their energy levels go up, which is a side effect, you could say. But in Bowen, we're trying to maintain or restore balance. And one way of thinking about that, and you're probably familiar with the whole biotensegrity and tensegrity world, which is all about how you can restore balance in the relationship between the tensional elements in the body. We rely on tension or appropriate tension to maintain posture. And that's really what we're trying to do in Bowen. We're trying to get the body back into balance by doing these very, very gentle moves which stimulate the fascia, because that's really what controls our posture. And we don't have to manipulate people heavily. We can just do these quite gentle moves and you see massive changes. So I think I'll call that a stop there. I think it's about 15 minutes to go. So I'm just going to come out of this and stop my sharing for a bit. And then we can take some questions. So I hope that was useful.
If you liked this video and you want to see more, make sure to subscribe below and don't forget to hit the notification button.